For most of recorded history, the same arrangement has appeared again and again. A population is promised stability in exchange for obedience, predictability in exchange for risk, a steady income in exchange for time. At first, it feels like progress. Specialized labor replaces subsistence, wages replace uncertainty. The system grows more efficient, more centralized, more productive. People stop worrying about survival and begin planning their lives around schedules, salaries, and expectations that seem permanent. Then something subtle happens. The arrangement that once protected people from chaos quietly becomes the mechanism that traps them inside it. Wages rise more slowly than costs. Debt fills the gap. Productivity increases, but ownership does not. The system becomes very good at extracting effort and very bad at distributing security. People work more hours, generate more value, and yet feel increasingly fragile. Not suddenly, gradually, quietly, so slowly that it feels personal rather than structural. This pattern is not modern. It is ancient. In late Republican Rome, free citizens abandoned independent trades to accept state stipends and guaranteed work. In imperial China, salaried bureaucrats became dependent on stipends that inflation steadily hollowed out. In early industrial Europe, wage labor replaced land ownership, concentrating productivity in factories while workers lived one missed paycheck from ruin. Each time, the promise was stability. Each time, the cost was autonomy. And each time, the end came not with invasion, but with exhaustion. The system never collapses because people stop working. It collapses because work stops working for them. Near the end of every cycle, people notice the same symptoms. They feel busy but stagnant, employed but insecure, surrounded by wealth they did not accumulate and cannot access. They blame themselves. They assume they chose the wrong career, negotiated poorly, failed to optimize. The system encourages this belief. Individual failure is easier to manage than collective realization. Meanwhile, the structure hardens. Fixed costs rise, mobility declines. Risk is pushed downward while rewards are pulled upward. The wage becomes not a tool for participation, but a ceiling. It defines not only income, but time, energy, and possibility. Life becomes something managed between pay periods. History shows that once a society reaches this stage, the outcome is never dramatic at first. There are no announcements, no single law, no moment when it is officially declared that the arrangement no longer serves the majority. Instead, people adapt. They normalize pressure. They recalibrate expectations downward. They tell themselves this is simply how adulthood feels. That belief has ended every time the same way. Because systems built on dependent labor can survive stress, recession, and even war. What they cannot survive is when the cost of participation exceeds the benefit, not emotionally, but mathematically. When wages no longer compound opportunity, but merely delay collapse. And when that line is crossed, the ending is no longer a choice. Collapse, in reality, rarely looks like collapse. It does not arrive with barricades or banners. It arrives as paperwork, as revised guidelines, as temporary measures that never quite expire. The outward structures remain intact long after the internal mechanics fail. Governments still function, markets still open, people still go to work. But the system's purpose quietly changes. Large-scale collapse almost always begins economically. Political instability is a downstream effect. Military decline is a lagging indicator. The first fracture appears when the system can no longer reconcile its promises with its incentives. When productivity, compensation, and cost drift out of alignment, not briefly, but structurally. At first, this drift is manageable. Debt absorbs the mismatch. Credit smooths consumption. Future growth is pulled forward to pay for present stability. This phase feels prosperous. Innovation accelerates. Asset prices rise. The system appears successful because motion is mistaken for health. Over time, however, debt stops being a bridge and becomes a foundation. Growth slows, but obligations do not. Wages flatten while fixed costs compound. Productivity continues to rise, yet fewer participants share in the upside. This is the stage where efficiency improves, but resilience disappears. Historically, collapse follows a recognizable sequence. The first stage is expansion. A system organizes labor more efficiently than its predecessors. It rewards participation. It raises living standards. Confidence grows. The second stage is optimization. Processes tighten. Output increases. Specialization deepens. Risk is reduced, but also concentrated. The third stage is financialization. Claims on future output multiply faster than the output itself. Debt expands. Asset ownership detaches from productive contribution. The system begins rewarding leverage more than labor. The fourth stage is compression. Costs rise faster than wages. Participation becomes mandatory rather than advantageous. People work to maintain position, not improve it. Mobility narrows. The fifth stage is dependency. Large portions of the population rely on fixed income streams, wages, stipends, contracts that adjust too slowly to protect purchasing power. Optionality disappears. The sixth stage is fragility. The system appears stable precisely because everyone is fully committed. Any disruption threatens cascading failure. Risk is normalized because it cannot be avoided. The final stage is irreversible decline. Not because collapse is sudden, but because reversal would require dismantling the very incentives that keep the system functioning day to day. At no point does a central authority announce this progression. It unfolds through incentives, not intent. Each individual decision is rational. Each institutional response is defensible. But collectively, they move in one direction only. This is why people living inside late-stage systems rarely recognize them as such. Life continues. Salaries are paid. The structure feels permanent because it has always been there. But permanence is not stability. It is merely duration. And duration, when mistaken for strength, is how systems pass the point where recovery is no longer an option. The Western Roman Empire offers one of the clearest examples of how a system can grow powerful, sophisticated, and yet structurally incapable of sustaining its own labor base. Rome's rise was built on productivity and integration. Roads, standardized law, and a unified currency allowed trade to move efficiently across vast distances. Early Roman citizens were landholders, artisans, and soldiers with a direct stake in the system's success. Wealth circulated locally. Labor and ownership were closely linked. As Rome expanded, that balance shifted. Conquest brought an influx of resources, slaves, and tribute. Productivity increased, but it was no longer distributed through broad ownership. Large estates replaced small farms. Independent producers were absorbed or displaced. Wealth began to flow upward and outward, concentrating in the hands of elites who were increasingly disconnected from local production. To maintain stability, Rome professionalized labor. Soldiers became salaried. Bureaucrats multiplied. Grain doles and stipends replaced self-sufficiency for much of the urban population. At first, this reduced volatility. People were fed. Order was maintained. The system appeared compassionate and efficient, but the costs were structural. As independent livelihoods disappeared, more citizens became dependent on fixed incomes controlled by the state. When military expenses rose and territorial expansion slowed, Rome turned to monetary distortion. Silver content in coins was gradually reduced. On paper, wages and payments remained the same. In reality, purchasing power eroded. Productivity declined as incentives weakened. Why invest in land improvements when taxes rose and profits fell? Why innovate when surplus was extracted? Consumption, however, did not decline. The imperial system demanded displays of prosperity, games, construction, military presence, long after the productive base had thinned. The social consequences were predictable. a shrinking middle class, rising inequality, a population increasingly detached from ownership and mobility. Work became survival, not advancement. Talented individuals sought security within the state rather than creating value outside it. By the time Rome attempted reforms, the system was already locked in. Restoring fiscal discipline would have required reducing military pay, shrinking bureaucracy, and re-empowering local production, all politically impossible. The empire continued to function administratively, even as its economic core hollowed out. Rome did not fall when barbarians crossed its borders. It fell when its labor system could no longer sustain the weight placed upon it. The invasions merely revealed what had already occurred. Wealth moved constantly through Rome. Taxes were collected, salaries were paid, goods were consumed. But wealth no longer stayed where it was created. It was extracted, diluted, and redistributed in ways that preserved appearances while destroying resilience. The Roman wage earner did not experience collapse as a dramatic event. He experienced it as stagnation, as heavier burdens, as the quiet realization that effort no longer led anywhere new. By the time the system failed openly, the trap had already closed. Centuries later, in a very different setting, the same logic reappeared, this time under the assumption that modern finance had finally made history obsolete. In the decades leading up to the French Revolution, France possessed one of the largest economies in Europe. Its population was productive, its culture influential, its state sophisticated. Administrators believed the system was resilient precisely because it was advanced. Complexity was mistaken for strength. The monarchy relied heavily on salaried administrators, tax farmers, and military officers whose incomes were fixed by decree rather than productivity. At the same time, the state accumulated enormous debt to fund wars, infrastructure, and court life. Rather than restructure incentives, officials assumed future growth would absorb the imbalance. For years, it appeared to work. Consumption remained high. Paris thrived. The machinery of the state continued to operate. But beneath the surface, the same stages repeated. Financialization intensified. Debt claims multiplied faster than real output. Taxes rose but fell disproportionately on wage earners and small producers who lacked political insulation. Inflation did not appear as a crisis at first. It appeared as inconvenience. Bread cost slightly more. Rents crept upward. Wages did not. Fixed incomes lost purchasing power year after year, not dramatically, but relentlessly. The belief that this time is different was widespread. France was culturally dominant. Its institutions were refined. Its intellectual class believed reason itself could manage any imbalance. Warnings were dismissed as reactionary or pessimistic. Denial became policy. Reforms were delayed because they threatened existing power structures. Each temporary measure deepened dependency. Each new loan preserved stability while narrowing future options. By the time fiscal reality could no longer be ignored, confidence had already fractured. The collapse, when it came, appeared political. But its roots were economic. A salaried class that could no longer afford subsistence. A productive population trapped beneath a financial superstructure extracting more than it returned. A system whose incentives punished adaptation and rewarded compliance. The revolution did not begin with ideology. It began with arithmetic. Like Rome, France demonstrated that systems do not fail because they are unjust in theory. They fail because they become unaffordable in practice. When wages are fixed, costs are flexible, and debt fills the gap, stability becomes an illusion maintained only by confidence. Once that confidence breaks, events accelerate. But the outcome is already decided long before the first public rupture. The pattern was never unique to ancient empires. It merely waits for each generation to rediscover it under new names, new instruments, and renewed certainty that this time it will end differently. The modern system differs in tools, scale, and speed, but not in structure. Wage labor has become the primary interface between individuals and the economy. For most people, income is no longer derived from ownership, but from permission. Permission to access work, to trade time for currency, to remain inside the system without penalty. Productivity has increased dramatically over the past half-century. Output per worker has risen across advanced economies. Technology has compressed time, reduced friction, and multiplied scale. Yet compensation has not followed the same trajectory. The gap between what labor produces and what it retains has widened, not because of malice, but because incentives quietly shifted. Debt filled the difference. As costs of housing, healthcare, education, and energy rose faster than wages, borrowing became normalized, not as emergency relief, but as infrastructure. Credit cards, student loans, auto financing, and mortgages became prerequisites for participation. The system did not break under this arrangement. It expanded. Consumption continued. Growth appeared stable, but debt changes behavior. It reduces optionality. It anchors people to income streams that cannot be interrupted. A worker with obligations cannot easily renegotiate, retrain, or step away. Risk tolerance collapses downward, even as risk accumulates upward. At the institutional level, the same logic applies. Corporations optimize for quarterly performance. Governments manage through rollover rather than resolution. Monetary expansion compensates for structural imbalance by preserving liquidity and confidence. None of these actions are irrational in isolation. Together, they reinforce dependency. Wealth increasingly flows through wages rather than into them. Income arrives, services debts, covers fixed costs, and exits. Little remains to compound. Participation is constant, but accumulation is rare. The system does not require people to be prosperous. It requires them to be solvent. This is why stress appears even during periods labeled as growth. Employment remains high, yet insecurity rises. Innovation accelerates, yet mobility declines. The system functions, but it no longer converts effort into independence for the majority. Importantly, this is not a story of intention. No central planner designed a salary trap. It emerged organically from incentives that rewarded efficiency, leverage, and scale while externalizing fragility. Systems fail not when intentions fail, but when incentives quietly turn against the people who sustain them. The modern wage earner is not oppressed by force. He is constrained by arithmetic. Fixed income meets flexible costs. Time is finite. Obligations are not. And as long as confidence holds, the structure remains intact, efficient, orderly, and increasingly brittle beneath the surface. Late-stage systems are defined by a paradox. They feel most stable precisely when they are least flexible. The surface is calm because every participant is fully committed. Institutions are synchronized, markets are liquid, employment is widespread. There is no obvious rupture because there is no slack left to absorb one. This is the acceleration phase. By this stage, risk is no longer debated. It is normalized. Rising debt is described as necessary. Expanding balance sheets are reframed as tools. Declining purchasing power is attributed to temporary factors. Each explanation is plausible on its own. Together, they form a narrative that prevents intervention. Institutions play a crucial role here, not through deception, but through alignment. Their survival depends on continuity. Abrupt change would threaten funding, legitimacy, and control. As a result, signals that would once trigger alarm are reclassified as noise. Warnings are absorbed into forecasts, footnotes, and long-term outlooks that place resolution safely beyond the present. For individuals, the experience is equally subtle. Pressure increases, but gradually. More hours are required to maintain the same standard of living. Savings rates decline. Resilience is replaced by optimization. People become very good at managing stress they should never have been asked to carry. This is also the phase where dissent sounds unreasonable. The system is still functioning. Salaries are still paid. Stores are still stocked. Questioning the structure feels abstract, even irresponsible. Those who point to imbalance are dismissed not because they are wrong, but because they are early. Acceleration does not mean collapse is imminent. It means options are disappearing. Each year of delay narrows the range of possible adjustments. By the time consequences become undeniable, the measures required to reverse them are politically, socially, and psychologically impossible. History shows that no system chooses contraction voluntarily. It expands until constrained by reality. When correction finally arrives, it appears sudden only because adaptation was postponed for so long. In this phase, the salary trap tightens without changing shape. It does not need to. Participation remains mandatory. Exit remains risky. The structure holds, right up until it cannot, and when it finally moves, it moves all at once, not because something new happened, but because nothing did. History does not repeat because people fail to learn. It repeats because systems built on incentives tend to recreate the same outcomes, even under new names and technologies. Each generation inherits structures it did not design, participates in them to survive, and adapts just enough to delay confrontation. The salary trap is not a conspiracy. It is an emergent property of large, complex systems that prioritize efficiency over resilience. Fixed incomes offer predictability, but they also transfer risk downward. When costs remain flexible and obligations compound, stability becomes conditional. Throughout history, people have assumed that collapse requires villains. In reality, it requires alignment. When enough participants depend on continuity, no one can afford to stop the machine. Not workers, not institutions, not policymakers. Momentum replaces intent. This is why these cycles persist. Not because individuals are irrational, but because rational decisions made within constrained systems produce predictable outcomes. People choose security over autonomy. Institutions choose stability over reform. Each choice makes sense. Together, they lock the pattern in place. Understanding this does not provide immunity. Awareness does not dissolve incentives, but it restores perspective. It reframes personal anxiety as structural tension. It explains why effort alone no longer guarantees advancement, and why exhaustion has become a feature rather than a failure. Every historical cycle ends the same way, not with universal collapse, but with reorganization. Power shifts, ownership restructures. New systems emerge from the remnants of the old. The process is disruptive, uneven, and indifferent to individual preparedness. The question is never whether the cycle will turn. It always does. The only uncertainty is how visible the transition will be to those living through it. For now, the system continues. Salaries arrive, obligations are met, life proceeds inside carefully managed constraints. That is how late stages always feel, normal until they are not. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.